Really thrilled to have Professor Richard Teese with us today. And he's, going to the very core of it. Who are we and where did we come from? As you know, he's Professor and Director with the Centre for Research on Education Systems at the University of Melbourne. His research is concerned with how well education systems function, and he works closely with state governments in Australia on system improvement and equity. So as you know, he's made seminal contributions to educational theory and policy, and again we have the luck with him today to hear another presentation from him. So ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Teese.
Thank you, Bernie, and good morning to everyone. And I'm delighted to be able to be here with you and to share my thoughts, such as they are. I'm certainly not going to rattle on about a crisis. I want to do exactly the opposite. I want to talk about what we have achieved and highlight the impact that the public high school system, or the public secondary school system as we should call it, has made over the last 50 years. But also I want to highlight some of the challenges that remain and that we need to deal with. But I don't have a crisis view, so I'm not negative about it, I'm very positive. So let me begin. We don't have a lot of time, and I've jammed a lot into this session. And although I've rehearsed it, it could go badly wrong. So let me begin with a fairly extravagant claim about the historical promise. And I'm basing myself on nearly a century of public efforts to create a really strong public secondary school system. So what is the promise, and are we fulfilling that, or are we at risk of jeopardising it? So I put my definition there, and it's a classical humanist definition. I hope everybody can read it. To provide every child with the opportunity to acquire the higher forms of knowledge on which our economic and social organisation is based. And it's an unreserved promise. It doesn't say, and that'll depend on who you are, where you are, etc. It's an unreserved promise. It doesn't promise that everybody is going to make it, but the opportunity and increasingly the outcome is there. So that's the promise, and you can see this in the 1910 Education Act for those who are interested, and even before then. So what's the pathway towards that vision? It has been to create a comprehensive public high school system serving every local community. It really is important to make those simple, straightforward statements as we look at where we are today. So what's the progress? And I'll just go through that very briefly in this presentation. In terms of creating a mass system in which everybody has got access to that facility, we're talking about a system that is about 50 to 60 years old, even though the first high schools go back to 1905, 1907, and then the 1910 Act. And I'm going to look through the different stages of that very quickly. Then I want to look at the impact. What difference has it made to have a universal system of public secondary education? That's something we need to defend, and we need to explore that in the first place. But then, given where we are today and the political environment, what are the challenges that we have to deal with? It's not a crisis, but what are the challenges? Because each year principals set out to address those challenges. In terms of today's policies, both at the state and the federal level, are the policy settings right, wrong, bad, etc. So we'll talk about that. And then what should we be doing to pursue the promise that has been made with every generation of builders of our public high school system. So in the first slide, I want to just reflect quickly on the progress that we have made over time in constructing this system, because it's too often thought we've had a high school system forever, but we haven't. We've had to build it. And we've done it over 3 stages. In this chart, I've just plotted the growth in year 12 numbers from 1947 up to the end of the last century to 1998 or something, about that time. The trend line looks very similar to grade retention rates, which we can only measure roughly from 1967. But that gives you an idea of the huge change that has occurred. And most of that impact is due to what your schools have been doing. It hasn't been private schools that have done this. It's the public high school system. And it's done this over several stages. In the first place, we had quite a differentiated system. We had girls' secondary schools, which were basically domestic arts schools. We had junior technical schools, as they were called. We had central schools because we didn't have enough district high schools in Melbourne. So we had a patchwork provision, and as numbers grew in the early post-war, we introduced streaming, ability testing, etc. But gradually we created a fairly common lower secondary school. So step number one, a fairly common lower secondary school. At that time, if we go back to the 40s, the compulsory leaving age before it was changed was 14. In the second stage, we then worked on upper secondary education. We began to diversify in the early 70s, right up until 1981, 1982. We had the rollout of the T12 Technical Year 12 certificate. We had HSC Group 1, Group 2. We had the tertiary orientation programs. And so we have opened up the space within public secondary education for people to pursue their schooling right up until they're 17 or 18. And finally, in the mid-1980s, beginning with the Blackburn Report, we started to integrate the whole system, both at a curriculum level through the VCE, but also at a structural level through the merging of the difference between technical and high schools. So by the end of the century, we had a unitary rather than a divided system. We had comprehensive schooling, we had a single certificate, very significant steps along the road to creating a comprehensive, universally accessible system. I'm not saying it was universally successful, but universally accessible in terms of a system of opportunity. So really good. So now, over that period of time, what impact has that made? And it's extremely important to think about the broader impacts, because you'll be pounded day in and day out with NAPLAN results, with PISA and the slide in the curve, etc. You need to stand back and have a much broader view of what the public secondary school system does. And I'm only going to do this briefly, but it's very significant. First of all, if you look at it historically, there's been a huge impact on the educational level of the population. Back at the start of the period we're talking about, early post-war, we have about 7 in 100 17-year-olds getting to the end of schooling, 7 in 100. By the end of the century, we had 10 times as many. It's a huge impact on the educational level of the population, and it has major economic impacts as well. We've found through the public high school system that the access of non-traditional groups to more specialised domains of knowledge has increased dramatically. So we have, thanks to the growth of the system, we have kids studying advanced mathematics, physics, languages. It's more disappointing. The traditional humanities a bit more disappointing, but generally a complete transformation. People who would not have been considered to have any chance of studying those complex materials, it's now commonplace. It's true we've got issues with it. Widening access to technical and higher education, I'm going to give some information about that because the last 15 or so years has been a bit disappointing in that respect, but again, we need a long-term view. We've enabled the population to adjust to major industry and labour market change. There has been a complete transformation in the structure of the Australian economy, and it's through the school system, the public high school system, that we have been able to enable the population to adjust to those dramatic changes. Huge numbers of full-time jobs have disappeared. The manufacturing sector has shrunk. At the same time, we have been pushing people to adapt, and we've been successful in that adaptation. It's more complicated to try to measure labour productivity, and I haven't tried to do this in this presentation. It's a painful concept. Widening social access to professional and managerial labour markets, which has been really great. social cohesion, the impact of the public high school system in terms of pulling this country together has been unmistakable and enormous. And this has been achieved at relatively low cost to families, and that's been absolutely indispensable. So these are the key impacts, and I would like you to keep these in mind each time you read a newspaper and are told that the school system is failing, that it's too expensive to run. Think about these big impacts, because the population depends on you. There are challenges and we need to face up to them. We have a large and widening gap in achievement between children from poorer backgrounds and children from better off backgrounds, and the gap in that plain terms is about 2 years. It's very significant. We don't need to be told about PISA to understand this. This is a local issue which we really have got to deal with, and we don't need this stimulus of PISA to do that. We have high schools struggling to make up the difference which they inherit from primary school, and that's not a criticism of primary schools, but it is a really big challenge. We have some pretty well documented patterns of disengagement during the early years of secondary school, and this afternoon Steve Lamb will be giving you some stuff which is mind-blowing on attendance patterns amongst other things. So it won't be just dealing with the SRP, you'll be interested to learn. Dropout continues to be high. Not all attrition is negative, I'll be the first to admit that, but some of it is, and it's linked to low achievement. There are problems of access to the curriculum. We have high schools where we can't offer a full range of curriculum, and we should be doing that. And given the promise that we made when we started building public high schools, we can't be going backwards. We need to expand access to that. There are, and have been from the beginning, from 1992, major gaps, social gaps in achievement in the DCE. It is the mainstream certificate, but it is racked with inequalities, and we have to work on that to turn the opportunity to study into really good outcomes. Transition outcomes continue to be weak for low achievers, and they're drawn disproportionately from poorer families. The transition to TAFE continues to slide, and this government has encouraged that by stripping the budget, and access to university continues to discriminate against the poor, and I'll give some data on that later. So, from the achievements, from the impacts that we've made, my conclusion is we've got the right opportunity structure. We've got a comprehensive public secondary school system. It's got runs on the board. This is a shot from a contemporary VCAB, as it was then, pamphlet, which captures the aim of being inclusive and open to all. But when we look at the challenges, we see that we've got a long way to go. Those challenges really relate to the fact that the population depends increasingly, not simply on participating, but learning effectively and being successful in school. So the challenge is basically from opportunity to outcome. Why, after 50, 60 years, have we still got these problems of inequity, of inequality, of problems of access, of problems of achievement? We've built a strong public high school system, but we're still not as successful as we need to with children from less well-educated backgrounds, and the question is, why? So I've got the theory here, which I'll give you an opportunity to read, rather than talking over you. Our reform efforts have concentrated on the formal structure of provision, and I'm going to explain what that means. We now need to turn to addressing aggressively the social and political factors which inhibit the success of children. So we've got the structure right, but we haven't dealt sufficiently firmly with the social and political factors that undermine access and that undermine achievement. Now, to see this, we have to take a brief theoretical detour, but I can promise you it's just a brief one, but it's really important to do it. So it really concerns the issue, where does inequality come? How come we've got it? Why don't we have a paradise of equity here? And we're not alone in this. So how do we get inequality? If we can't answer this question, how do we expect schools to deal with it? And it's not just an issue for schools. It's also an issue for systems and the politicians. So if we look at it from a theoretical angle, can you explain social inequality? The first approach I would have is to look at curriculum-based differences in provision. Curriculum-based differences in provision. So one of the sources of inequality, which can be described as a vertical differentiation, is we create different types of schools, some where we've got high expectations, others where we've got low expectations, and we lock kids into this system. Historically, that's what we did. So we've got a knowledge hierarchy. So just keep that in mind. We've got a knowledge hierarchy, and initially it works well as a tool for building participation, but eventually it becomes restrictive. At the same time, so it's a little shot from Preston Tech from the 1950s. Those of you who are as old as me will remember that with affection, with a certain ambivalence, but that's an example. Now, you don't want to think about this as a negative step. It's actually quite a positive step, but it runs out of steam after a while. Now, the other source of inequality is what we call lateral, where we get the impacts of social area, of where you live, and the impacts of private schooling, combining together to weaken the benefits that could come by having a good curriculum and an expansive public high school system. So we get hierarchies of schools. These are not curriculum based, they're socially based. Just a little shot to add to the interest of the presentation of a starving school in the private sector. And between these two dimensions, the vertical and the horizontal, we get inequality. And why am I going to this trouble? Because what I want to say is you can't deal with inequality simply on one axis or the other. You've got to attack inequality on two axes. So what has been our approach? And I said before, yeah, we focused on the formal structure. So let me explain that. And what should we be doing? So let's go down the path of history. This is the path of reform where we try to reduce curriculum-based differences so that everybody gets access to the most demanding elements of the curriculum. So we dismantled, over the last 50 to 60 years, those of you who are much younger than me may not know about what the school system looked like in the 40s, so I'm going to briefly comment on that. So we had girls' secondary schools, some of which didn't get a science lab until the mid-70s, long after Geelong Grammar got its one at the public expense. We had central schools, which since the 32 Fees Act, they're much older than that, they're as old as 1910, were a privileged route through to the senior high schools. We had junior technical schools, which were open as a bridge between elementary schooling and the technical colleges. Then we removed the middle years exams, we removed the intermediate certificate, we removed the leaving certificate, which is just as well because I didn't have it when I attempted as an adult student my matric and was told to nick off. Where's your leaving certificate? But I wasn't at school. Well, too bad. You're not allowed to sit the exams. We ended ability grouping and streaming. We created a common certificate. I put a question mark because we might have gone backwards a bit on that one. But in all of those ways, we have reduced vertical stratification of our school system. We have created more and more comprehensive provision. Really good, in my view, really good step, and the evidence from international research suggests that has been the right way to go. Comprehensive system, delayed specialisation, removal of early selection. Not all systems around the world have followed that. In other countries, including Germany, for example, we're still selecting at age 10. At age 10. What about on the horizontal front? What have we done to reduce the impact of social factors? So we've been hard at work on that, not that it's been without controversy. We've made, over the long term, very significant reductions in class sizes, and I'll give some evidence for that in a moment. Since the 70s, we've brought in equity funding. It's been peanuts and it remains peanuts. But it's a step in the right direction, and it's a pointer to how we should be going, for example, through the loadings in the Gonski model whenever we see it. We've done additional things such as appointing welfare coordinators even in primary schools, although I'm not sure whether they all have them at this moment. So what we've been doing is we have been working on the social front, not simply the curriculum front. Just take you back to 1959, which I'm sure you're anxious to return to. The average, the median for grade 5 and 6 classes then was 42 to 43 kids. And you can see that there are classes much bigger than that. So we really have put in an effort. It's significant, and we needed to do that if we were going to have a vibrant and highly performing high school system. You can't make a mess of primary schools. Excuse me. So, good. What about today? So are we in the direction of supporting all those efforts that have been made by our ancestors, as it were, or are we backtracking and ripping up the rails that we built? So I would say first that, in my observation, the social pressures on the performance of our public high school system have intensified. So we're actually going backwards on the social front. How do I know that? We're cutting funds out of the public school system. We've been quite aggressive about that. On the other hand, we've increased the capacity of parents to pursue private advantage and differentiate, seek distinction, seek advantage through increased funding for private schools. We've actually gone back, and this was a Labor government initiative, and I know you might find this controversial, but I don't. Selective entry high schools, why do we need more of them? The answer at the time was to win back the middle class, but someone's going to pay for that. And I don't mind saying so. In that context of those increasing social pressures, it's not surprising that selection is returning to our system. So we have more schools with SEAL programs. I'm not blaming schools for operating SEAL programs. What choice do they have? But it's significant that it represents a return towards an earlier epoch in which the pressure is on the public system to differentiate rather than include. We've got other forms of selective provision, accelerated learning programs, etc. In some schools we're seeing a loss of academic options, and I think that's extremely serious. We're seeing the growth of VCE. I don't know whether VCAL is growing anymore because of the cuts to coordination funding, but we are seeing pressure to differentiate, and I think that this is retrograde. We already have a public high school system which is sharply differentiated from the private school system, but internally as well, and it's at risk of fragmentation. And Frank made a comment which I've forgotten the exact words, but it was along the lines, we've let you go on your own, and that's a good thing up to a point, and I agree, but up to a point it's a good thing. Just show you this chart, which I should be a bit coy about where it came from. But I'm going to show you where our high schools sit in 2010 on Year 9 reading means, and on the horizontal axis I've got who you are in social terms as measured by ACARA. So there's the spread of public high schools in Victoria in 2010. Where the axes meet, the origins of the axes are the means on SES and the means on Year 9 reading for all schools in the state, non-government included. It's quite a striking chart, and the question I'm going to raise is whether our emphasis on autonomy is not going a bit too far when we've got a risk of fragmenting our system and denying mutual support to our schools and withdrawing from system obligations to support, not dominate, but to support. I'll put the Catholic schools in there in green and the private schools there in yellow. So it is, you can fit a diagonal to this. The relationship is really strong. So you'll be told in the press by the Grattan Institute, etc., the shadow spokesman for education, or for private education at any rate, that it doesn't matter, SES doesn't matter. Well, sorry, it has a big impact. And the challenge that we face, that the government must face up to, is the severity of the challenge. Can't get rid of this just by autonomising the school system. Now, a lot of this is due to differences in where you live and who the population is, to the degree of segregation, which in international terms is quite high in our system. This is a Bureau of Statistics map, but just to capture where adults are who are poorly educated and the difference in tension that this creates in a system that is comprehensive. So the darker the red, the more ignorant the population is, if you'll forgive me being blunt. And this has very significant implications, because some of you are going to be in these very red areas and some of you are not. But if you're in a red area, your needs are going to be different, and the education policy that we have, or fail to have, has really got to be dealing with the stuff in the red without damaging opportunities and outcomes. And this is not even to take into account regional and rural Victoria. And we've got lots of red there. In fact, there are areas in regional and rural Victoria where no one has finished school, or practically. But it's not just a question. This provides the residential base. But on top of that, we've got another scourge, which is private selective schooling. So I just want to give, before I get to that, I just want to give you an idea of where segregation in residential terms leads in terms of the intakes to public high schools. So on this chart, I'm going to take all the schools in Victoria that are public high schools, and I'm going to do a kind of spectrum analysis of who they've got. And it's pretty summary, but it's pretty hectic at work, so I can't get a lot done. So this, the height of the column is the percentage of poor kids in your school. There's no private schools here because they don't, and we're going to see what the private schools look like. Right? But for the moment, we'll just look at the public schools. So it's true, you've got some public high schools that only got about 1 in 10 kids from a poor background, but there's very few of them. But on the other hand, you've got schools in which over 80% are from a poor background. Maybe this is not new to you, but I think it would be certainly new to your masters in Treasury Place. So we've got a system which actually concentrates disadvantage. It actually accumulates disadvantage. And that's your access to high SES kids. Same schools, I've just left out the 2 intermediate bands there, the unshaded area. So I hope everybody understands this chart. I haven't explained it too much, but everybody okay with the chart? Yep, good. So you've got high exposure to low SES, and you've got limited access to the high SES. That, I'm going to come back to just what that means. So the social area differences that are already profound, but in that chart I capture an overlay of selective schooling. Because when we look at stuff at a local level, we find the pick and choose pattern which tends to residualise local high schools. So here I've got a nameless country town in Victoria, fairly big, but nameless. And here we got which year 7s do they get in the local area? Is it random? Do they have access to the whole of the population in the local area? That's the question. Do they have access to the whole of the population, or only part of the population? So we look at this and we see the red bits, which are 36%, which is formerly at-risk kids, i.e. they're illiterate or semi-illiterate. So they roll up to the local high school. Down the road, literally, we've got a non-government school, which is effusive about its social justice credentials. But I can't see them. I've got 16%, but up the road, I've got double that. And at the top of the scale, I've got 9 plus 22, 31% top reading bands compared to 17. This happens right across the country. So on top of the social area differentiation, we've got a second layer called pick and choose. And then we come along and add additional support for the pick and choose process. So not only do we not deal adequately with the underlying residential problem, we actually worsen it by paying schools to poach the most advantaged kids from the system. Just a little snapshot of a very distinguished institution which has $61 million in fees. It makes a profit of $3.6 million a year, and it's enabled to pick and choose right across the country. And I'm sure you know what school it is because it made headlines for being run on strictly business lines. When Gonski came out, the Victorian government, instead of saying, what's this going to do for public education, the first point of loyalty for a minister, what is it going to do for public education? Instead, we want guarantees on private school funding. So where is the balance here? And since then, we've had an intention, at any rate, to lift the subsidy level arbitrarily to 25%. Where is the accountability in return? Does that mean you will give up some more talented kids, that you will take in some more demanding kids? Is there any accountability from that sector in terms of the commitment to local communities, or is it all a one-sided relationship that I've suggested? So instead of a concentration of disadvantage in that sector, we're getting a concentration of advantage. So here I got the same chart, but this time I've got it for private schools. So yeah, that's true, they've got some poor people in there. And sometimes it reaches as high as 50%. Well, we know what those schools are. They're small ethnic or Christian fundamentalist schools. But I've got schools where no one's poor, zero. And they're still getting subsidies of a significant order. Zero hard work, and they still get a subsidy. Figure that. And that is where our better half lives in the school system. So it's a massive concentration of advantage. So we've got a kind of social physics in our school system. And this is all happening on the horizontal domain. So we've got a comprehensive curriculum, we've got a unitary school system. On the curriculum front, we've worked really hard to create a formal, open, accessible structure to give everybody a chance. On the horizontal front, we've undermined it. So, the private sector has low exposure to the most demanding populations and high access to the other end. No wonder it gloats, and no longer it feels faintly embarrassed when per student funding is announced, and you know how understated that is, the extent of the contrast. If we've got such a sector and we let it loose, of course it's going to be academically dominant, and it's going to impart a conservative influence right through the whole system. And that leads back to why we've got SEAL programs, why we've got more selective entry schools, because we're putting public schools back on the back foot and forcing them into a defensive posture. Just tell you about the university offer rates, which I'm sure you're keen to know about. This is some work from the Centre for the Study of Higher Ed, and it looked at the difference from 2007 to 2011 of offer rates to kids from different sectors of schooling. Now, this is the period when we moved from capped funding, where the federal government's no more, to uncapped funding, where the federal government said, enrol who you like, we pay. So, has that had a big impact, and is it in the right area where we really wanted to? Because what Bradley, the reformer, wanted, and what the Gillard government wants, is higher participation of kids from poorer backgrounds, because there hadn't been any growth since 1992, and it looks pretty bad. So there's 2007. An offer rate, by the way, doesn't mean an enrolment rate. So yep, 2007, 58% get an offer. Bang! We're up to 71%, it's a 13-point improvement. Always welcome. Fair enough. Where were the Catholic schools in 2007? Well, they were already 8 percentage points ahead of the public high school system. Now they're 14 percentage points ahead of where they were, so they're gone ahead. They're still ahead, in fact, more ahead than they were before. And then we got the private schools. They were 71%, which is a figure you want to keep in mind, and now they're 85%. So they're even more ahead than they were in the past. Sorry, I thought this was supposed to be an equity game. This doesn't look like equity to me. So we can see the high schools catch up to where the private schools were 5 years ago. So, but they're even further behind in relative terms. So there's the 71%. The high school rate is up, but across the whole system, the growth in the representation of poor people in undergraduate enrolments has increased in a derisory 1% over the whole of that time. So we really haven't got a bang for the buck. It's gone in the other direction. The Catholic schools have increased, and the private secondary schools are miles ahead, and indeed further ahead. And of course, how can they be further ahead? Because they've got an engine of funding which is exploiting significant social and cultural advantages. So they're going to be dominating while we retain those policy settings. So we've built a fantastic public secondary school system, but it's under intense pressure. It's under pressure from parents who are nervous, who are anxious. It's under pressure from government who are driven by austerity concepts and spending doesn't mean anything. Which way do we go? We work really hard on curriculum. Can we keep working on curriculum to make it inclusive, accessible, effective for people? Because that's the direction of our historical effort, has been to reduce the differences between individuals in terms of their access to the curriculum. And we want to actually make the curriculum more demanding to meet the needs of the new century. So we don't want to lower our expectations on kids. And the curriculum is the main vehicle for driving up our expectations. It should be an engine of achievement. We want it to be an engine of achievement. But if we're to do that, we've got to work on the social and the political forces that inhibit access and that weaken achievement. And we need to keep this constantly in mind, because the newspapers and the right-wing think tanks are telling government every day spending doesn't matter, you can cut. It doesn't matter about choice policies, they're not doing any damage. Well, I've just suggested that they're doing huge damage. So, a really important point to think about is, you want to reduce disadvantage. How far do you want to go? How far do you want to go? It becomes a fundamental philosophical issue as to what we've got a public high school system for. It is a fundamental philosophical issue. And when I started this presentation, I highlighted what I see as the promise. It means raising standards, it means making high demands on the population, but it means supporting them. We need an expansive concept of public education. And of course, if we have that, it is going to be expensive. That's what it's about, getting maximum output from kids. If, on the other hand, you have a mean concept of public secondary education, don't expect more than you're getting now, and even that's probably too much. So I want to talk briefly about the weak concept of public secondary education that this current government, it keeps changing, but the current government, whatever you want to call it, has got. So if you ask the current government, well, tell me, what is the distinctive nature and purpose of a public high school? It's a perfectly reasonable question. What is the distinctive nature of the public high school system in Victoria? First, we don't like to talk about system. Secondly, it is autonomous. Yeah, and, well, that's about it. It's autonomous. So you can write this definition. Local decision making, the panacea, public sector, I wrote it for them. Is a sector of relatively autonomous schools which adapt to local circumstances and needs. So that's it. Our ancestors would have turned in their grave to see such a narrow, limited, impoverished concept of what public secondary schooling is about. I'm in favour of self-management. I think it's really good, providing it's supported properly, providing it's not a recipe for fragmenting, atomising the public system, providing it's not a recipe for lowering expectations on what public high schools should achieve. Even that definition is wrong because, as I've just shown you with those charts, public high schools don't have unfettered access to their local communities. They only have selective access to their local communities because choice policies, which are the primary thing in the policy documents of the present government, choice policies actually inhibit your access. You can't get access to the whole of the community, so what's the point of having your autonomy? Well, okay, you're free to manage your staffing profile and to manage your budget. So congratulations. That's really fantastic. Well, can you get the teachers you need? Can you compete with private schools for specialist teachers? The stories I've been told by principals here and across the state really are most eloquent about this. Can you train your own staff? It's a really significant issue. Local adaptation, right? You've got local adaptation, means you should be able to train your own staff. Train your own staff? How much staffing flexibility have you actually got? Do you have an influence over the kind of teachers that come straight out of university, including my university? I don't think you have any influence whatsoever. Even though you're the employer, in a narrower sense, you're the manager, you don't control who steps into the market, you depend on who is put into the market. You've got no control over what happens in the training process, or very limited. You're free to decide your own programs, are you? It depends on who you are, where you are, how big you are, all of those factors. So when I hear the Minister saying he's going to autonomise the curriculum, really, with what? You can't release your staff, you can't train your staff, you've got very conservative parents. When you have no system support behind self-management, you are at a big risk in my view. So I see the current policy settings, and I don't wish to be pessimistic, I wish to challenge them. I see them as saying, shrink into what's left of your local community. Whereas what we're saying to non-government schools is go global. We're saying to the local high school, you just keep to the local area or what's left of it for you. That's your job. Autonomous, adapt to the local area. Now, in fact, the building of public high schools was never predicated on that philosophy. It said you transcend the limits of the local area. Yes, this is the Mallee, this is the Wimmera, this is East Gippsland. You're still going to teach an academic curriculum. You are going to transcend the limits of local area. We want to lift the population up, not sink with it. Just notice, not that I want to pick on a particular school, but 2/3 of Westbourne's group are busted. No one says you private school adjust to your locality. On the contrary, here's a travel allowance which was originally conceived 100 years ago to support kids in the bush to go to elementary school. It's now being used to support the global expansion policies of a private system, including the one that collapsed recently that had a branch in China. So what's missing in the concept? Now, here's why I'm doing this. Before you put the bill in to the state government and the federal government, you need to explain what the nature of the service is. It should be listed on the invoice. So what's the nature of the service? That's the concept of public secondary education that you're delivering. If you put a bill in that says, for provision of self-managing services, don't expect to put a big figure at the foot of the invoice. You need to put in a bill which goes to the top of your aspirations and says, this is our business and this is what it cost. So that's what I'm trying to do here, is to construct the invoice. There's no requirement, contrary to the historical promise of a public high school, there's no requirement that you cover the whole of the curriculum. You put in the curriculum you can manage, the classes you can fill, with the teachers you've got and the interest level of the kids themselves. So, if you can't teach a language, you don't teach a language. If you can't teach history, you don't teach history. There are schools in the state that don't teach chemistry, that can't teach, Dale will tell you, that can't teach specialist maths. City schools that can't teach specialist maths. Maybe we shouldn't be teaching specialist maths, but at the moment it's on the menu and you can't teach it. There's no view about minimum standards of provision. There's no view about absolute standards of achievement. Everything is intake adjusted. I know because I work in the research area that does all the adjustment. And I keep asking myself, well, what's the point of merely being as good as your kids will let you? And historically, we have never done that. We've said, I don't care who you are. This is the standard. Our job is to support you to get there. Not halfway there or quarter way there and then rest on my laurels. That's the best I can do because that's the best you, the child, will allow me to do. What educator has ever reasoned like that? There's no requirement. There's no public requirement that public high schools have access to the totality of their local community. There's not, in other countries, in Scandinavia, for example, this would be viewed as abhorrent. What do you mean you don't have access to middle-class families? And if you don't have access to middle-class families, the whole business of educating the poor gets more and more complicated because you don't have access to pilot students, to high aspirations, to peer effects of a positive kind. No one is saying a public high school system should have access to the whole of the local community. We are just accepting you should have finite, limited, selective access. So, of course, if you put that in the bill, we undertake only to educate the poor and only to a standard which the poor are capable of. You don't expect to get a large cheque in the mail because you've already given up the game. So what I'm trying to do here is to build up the concept so that we can go back to the historical promise and we can get the level of support we need. We have a weak concept of inclusiveness. More and more the government is relying on alternative settings to deal with cases that it can't deal with because it won't support schools adequately. You have to wait months for specialist service. You can't provide the comprehensive service that you should be. And of course on the buildings and grounds, we've had graphic illustration in the last month. No disrespect to Sunbury, but I couldn't resist pinching this from the age. The building is falling apart. It looks like it was designed pretty badly anyway. Smash those bricks down and put a steel pylon through it. Brilliant. So what should a public high school and a public high school system look like? And I hope I'm not running too far over time. It's got to be socially integrative. We have to articulate these demands. It's got to be socially integrative. It is not just for the poor. It should be a means of pooling resources. So we have the whole of a local community contributing to the work of the school. It should be bringing families together. It's not a means of exploiting social advantage. You want to exploit social advantage, that's the labour market, the business market, go and do it there. But schooling, no. Schooling is about citizenship and about getting the best you can from every child. It's not about creating divisions. The 1872 Act makes that perfectly clear. We're not about reproducing ethnic or religious or whatever divisions. That's not the business of a public high school system. It should be socially inclusive. So all children should have access to high cognitive demand subjects. Kids with high needs require the additional support of a meaningful level. It should be high performing, but not in a narrow sense. What does that actually mean, high performing? It means it works well for all kids on a range of important qualitative measures. We're about creating good citizens and productive workers. It's not just cognitive gain that we should be concerned about, important as that is. We should be using our public high school system, as we have in the past, to deepen the pool, the intellectual pool, the talent pool. Our schools must be academically demanding to fulfil the historical promise. They have to be academically demanding, but to be academically demanding of all, you need a high level of support. Should be good transition outcomes for all groups. We need a curriculum-rich environment, wide range of courses and stimulating activities. We need to be pedagogically adaptive. I mean, these are the things the public high school system should be famous for. And note, there's a sting in the tail of some of these. If the school is to be a site of continuous professional development, there must be the release time to permit that to happen. There must be a budget to deal with that. The schools should be well resourced and efficient. And what does that mean? I've spelt that out here. So this is the last slide that I'm coming to. So I now want to wrap this up. Am I on time, Bernie? Or?
Yes.
All right. You don't sound convincing. First of all, this is the last slide, so I want to try to pull this together because it's been a long, complex journey there. We actually start with philosophy. I know those who have studied philosophy at university may tire of that quickly, but the philosophy is we need an expansive concept of public education. We really need to be very forthright about that. We should enshrine that in a charter. There ought to be a charter of public secondary education. A charter sets out what we're on about. Why is it important to have public education? What's at stake? What has been achieved? We need to set this out so that the public high school system is protected from niggardly governments who come and go, as we've just seen recently. So we need a charter which sets out what this sector aims to do, and we don't have that, at least I don't know of one but we really need it, because if we don't, we can't formulate precise and expansive expectations on performance. You need access to the whole of your local community if your autonomy is to work. And for that, you must have a comprehensive curriculum, and that must be paid for. You need specialist teachers. You shouldn't be improvising. You need lots of staffing flexibility. You need to be able to provide intensive support. And you need to be able to work very actively in your local community to build relationships. We have to regulate growth of private schools because it is having such a devastating impact at a local level. And it's annoying that the Gonski recommendation for a state planning authority has just not even been discussed not even discussed in public, because it's too sensitive, because the agenda from the non-government sector is expansionary. Give us money and don't ask too many questions. We want to grow. And don't ask us who growth leaves behind. We need financial incentives for government high schools to work together, to share resources, to integrate timetables so they can overcome some of the limitations of size and location. We need greater accountability on government. So far, the emphasis has been on accountability at the individual school level. You've got, I don't know how many pages the school level report is, but the last time I looked at it, it was monstrous. I mean, all the pressure is on what you are doing or failing to do as an atom in an atomised system. Really need to be turning the focus back on government and saying, we've got a charter. These are the things that really count for the Australian community. This is what our need is, this is what our impact is. What are you, government, doing to serve this vision? And the last point, we don't have any independent reporting of what happens in public secondary education. There is no report on what you've achieved in the last 5 years or the last year. There's no report on who your kids are, or what you're trying to do for those kids. There's nothing. If someone from overseas comes here and says, oh, you've got a public high school system, that's fantastic. We've got one at home too. That's really good. What do you hope to do with your public high school system? And what are the runs on the board? And how do you know it works? And just a few insolent questions perhaps, but where is the report that you can put on the table? And would you trust this government to create such a report? Because I wouldn't. So we need to hold the mirror up to ourselves about the vitality and the great importance of the sector. But at the moment we lack that visibility. So if we have a charter, we also need independent reporting. And on that note, I thank you for your indulgence.